Life seemed perfect. I was 35 years old, had a beautiful family, 2 adorable children, and a 12-year marriage to Mark, the man I knew would be by my side until the end. We lived in a small town outside of Boston, in a cozy house that smelled of fresh coffee in the mornings and children's laughter the rest of the day. I was a literature teacher at a local school, and my life, although hectic, was simple and full of moments of happiness. I felt safe, like I had all the time in the world to fulfill the dreams Mark and I had, like traveling to Italy and watching our children, Hannah and Ethan, grow up. But like lightning on a clear day, my life fell apart. It all started banally, with a routine appointment that I would never have imagined would change my life forever. Dr. Wilson, my trusted doctor, ordered some more detailed tests after detecting an abnormality in my results. At that time, I was full of energy, taking care of the children and fulfilling my responsibilities without thinking much about it. After all, I felt healthy. It couldn't be anything serious, right? I got the call from him one afternoon while driving to pick up the kids from school. "Emily, we need to talk. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning?" His voice sounded different, something that immediately made me uneasy. Even so, I shook off the bad thought and continued my routine, certain that it was nothing serious. I didn't yet know that this would be the last day of normality I would experience for a long time. The next morning, I entered the office with a slight anxiety in my stomach, but without imagining what was to come. Dr. Wilson was sitting, his expression serious and troubled. He didn't take long to say the words that would echo in my mind for months to come. "Emily, we found something in your tests. It's cancer. Advanced stage ovarian cancer." The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. "Cancer? Advanced stage?" The words jumbled and lost meaning as my mind desperately tried to keep up. I looked at him for a mistake, a correction, but he just continued, detailing what I couldn't process. There was no cure for my type of cancer, only palliative treatments that could prolong my life for a little while longer. Suddenly, all the time I thought I had disappeared. I returned home in silence, my chest tight, my head spinning with the question I didn't want to silence. How'd I tell my family that my time was running out? When I walked into the house that night, Mark was in the kitchen, busy preparing dinner. The children played in the living room, and the sound of their laughter contrasted painfully with the weight of what I carried inside me. He looked at me and smiled, not knowing what he was about to hear. I moved closer, and before I could think of a better way to say it, the words slipped out of my mouth like a whisper. "Mark, I'm dying." Quote. He tried, in every way, to be strong, but I saw the shadow of despair in his eyes. He, like me, didn't know how to move forward with that new reality. Telling the kids was the hardest task I've ever faced. How do you tell your children that their mother may not be there to see them grow up? Mark and I discussed for hours how to approach the subject. We wanted to be honest, but without taking away from them the innocence and security they still had. We decided it was time to talk to them one late afternoon when things were calm at home. Hannah, aged 7, has always been perceptive. When we sat down with her and Ethan in the living room, she immediately knew something was wrong. Mark began to speak in a shaky voice, explaining that Mom was sick, that she would need a lot of treatment, and that things would be difficult for a while. Ethan, so small and full of life, just looked at us, confused. Are you going to be okay, Mommy? He asked, his voice full of innocence. I swallowed the lump that was forming in my throat and, with all the effort in the world, I smiled. I'll do everything I can to get better, my love. That seemed like enough for them at that moment, but inside, I felt torn apart. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Mark lay next to me, the silence between us filled with everything we couldn't say out loud. Neither of us knew how to move forward, but we knew we had no choice but to try. The first chemotherapy session arrived quickly, and with it came tiredness, nausea and growing fear. I felt my body beginning to give in to exhaustion. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman reflected. But as much as my body was deteriorating, I knew I needed to be strong, at least for the children. What hurt most was not the physical impact, but the emotional burden she carried every day, thinking about the possibility of leaving Hannah and Ethan prematurely. I started writing letters to them, something that gave me a minimal sense of control. Each night, before going to sleep, I wrote down a few words, as if I wanted to ensure that in the future, when I was no longer there, they would still have my voice to guide them. Dear Hannah, I wrote on one of them, when you grow up, I want you to know that you can be whoever you want to be. I will always be with you, in some way. The words were filled with tears, but they were the only comfort I had. The nights, which were once peaceful, became long and lonely. Even with Mark by my side, fear was a constant presence. I wondered how he would be able to continue when I was no longer there. He hugged me tightly, but the silence between us spoke more than any words. The days dragged on as I tried to adapt to a new reality. Each chemotherapy session left me weaker, and the treatment felt like a never-ending battle. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, struggling to wake up but unable to escape. My body, which had once been healthy and full of energy, now felt like a battlefield, and I wondered if I would be able to continue. Mark tried to be strong for both of us, but I knew he was struggling with his own despair. Some nights, I would see him in the dark of his room, staring at the ceiling, lost in thoughts he didn't share. I wanted to comfort him, but how could I comfort someone when I couldn't even find comfort myself? Children, on the other hand, were the light in my dark days. Hannah continued to draw flowers and landscapes, always presenting me with her lively doodles. Ethan, with his infinite energy, ran around the house, trying to make me laugh with his silly jokes. They still didn't fully understand the gravity of what we were facing, and so they managed to bring a certain lightness to the environment, something I desperately needed. It was in the midst of this emotional chaos that I received news that, in a way, brought me hope and despair at the same time. After months of exhaustive treatment, Dr. Wilson called Mark and me in for a consultation. Sitting in his office, the silence was heavy as he looked at my latest results. Emily, he began, his voice calm but with a gravity that kept me on alert. The results show that the tumor has stopped spreading. We're not talking about a cure, but it is a sign that the treatment is working. Effect. I didn't know how to process it. On the one hand, it was a victory, a small glimmer of hope in the midst of so much darkness. But at the same time, there was still a long and uncertain road ahead. The news that the cancer had stopped spreading should have been a relief. And, for a while, it was. It was as if a heavy cloud had lifted a little, allowing a small ray of sunlight to pass through the darkness. Mark, who had been carrying the weight of my illness on his shoulders for months, finally smiled a genuine smile, and for the first time, we could breathe with a little less fear. But for me, what should have been a moment of hope also brought a new internal battle. I was relieved, of course, but also completely exhausted. With each chemotherapy session, my body weakened even more, and I began to wonder how much more I could take. The physical pain was brutal, but the real suffering came from the emotional struggle. How could you continue fighting when there was no guarantee that all this suffering would bring any lasting results? How could I hold on to hope when there was still a real possibility that the cancer would grow again and, this time, without stopping? Letters to Hannah and Ethan were still my anchor. They helped me keep my head up, even when despair tried to drag me down. At that stage, there had already been dozens of letters. Birthday letters, letters for when they started working, when they got married, when they had children of their own. I wanted that if the worst happened, they would know who I was, how much I loved them, and how much they meant to me. Writing gave me the illusion that I would somehow still be present in their lives, even when I wasn't physically there. One night, after one of the toughest chemotherapy sessions, I was lying in bed, exhausted. Mark was at my side, but the stillness between us was palpable. He knew I was on edge, and I knew he was struggling to find words that could comfort me. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was low and full of hesitation. "Emily, what do you think will happen?" That question hit me like a punch in the stomach. It was the question I avoided answering for myself. I don't know, Mark. I don't know what's going to happen. My voice came out weaker than I intended, almost a whisper. He shook my hand, his eyes fixed on mine. "Whatever it is, I'll be here with you. Your unwavering commitment to being there for me, even in the face of uncertainty, was the only thing that gave me the strength to carry on." He always reminded me that I was not alone in this fight. And as much as fear tried to paralyze me, I knew that, for him and for our children, I needed to keep trying. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster. There were days when I felt optimistic, like life was finally falling into place, offering me a fairer fighting chance. And there were other days when tiredness consumed me, and I wondered if it was all worth it. During those days, I looked at Mark and the children, and it gave me strength. As difficult as it was, I knew I couldn't give up. Every little moment I spent with them was a reminder that there was still so much to fight for. It was on a sunny afternoon that I got my first glimpse of what life could be like if I could win this battle. Mark had taken the day off, and we decided we would go for a picnic at a nearby park. I was weak, and my legs barely had the strength to support me for long periods, but the simple fact of leaving the house, of being outdoors with my family, brought a freshness that I hadn't felt in months. As Hannah and Ethan ran across the lawn, their laughter echoing in the air, Mark helped me sit on a blanket he had spread out on the grass. The sun was warm, and I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to absorb all the energy of that day. "Do you remember when we used to come here before the kids were born?" Mark asked, his voice soft but full of memories. I smiled, remembering the carefree afternoons we spent in that same park, dreaming about the future, about the life we were building together. "Yes," I replied, my voice low but calm. "Back then, life seemed so simple." Mark laughed softly. "It was. But even with everything we're going through, I still think our life is good. We have our kids, we have each other." And we have moments like this. What he said kept echoing in my mind. Even in the midst of so much pain, there was still beauty. There were still moments worth fighting for. That night, while the children slept and the house was enveloped in silence, I sat down to write one more letter. This time the letter was for Mark. Unlike the letters to Hannah and Ethan, which were full of advice and promises, this one was different. I wrote about what he meant to me, about what our years together had taught me, and about how, no matter what, I knew he would be strong enough to carry on. I didn't know when he would read that letter, but something in me said he would need it, somehow, at some point. As the weeks went by, the fatigue was not only physical, but also emotional. The chemotherapy sessions continued, and although the results still showed some improvement, the process was exhausting. My body seemed increasingly fragile, and my mind sometimes flirted with the idea of giving up. I knew Mark and the kids needed me, but I also knew I was losing pieces of myself every day. Mark never complained. He was always by my side, holding my hand, helping me with the simplest tasks. He had become the father and husband he always knew he would be, but now, he was taking on responsibilities that were once shared. I saw the weight of the situation on his shoulders, but he refused to show weakness. When I looked at him one night, seeing the deep dark circles on his face and the tiredness in his eyes, I realized how much this disease was taking not just on me, but on everyone around me. "You don't have to be strong all the time," I said, my voice weak but sincere. Mark shook his head and smiled sadly. "If I'm not strong for you, who will be?" I wanted to tell him that it was okay, that he didn't have to carry this burden alone. But at the same time, I knew he needed to believe he was doing what was right. The disease, in a way, had brought us even closer together, but it also tested us every day. There were days when I wondered if, at the end of all this, there would still be something left of us. The pressure was enormous, and our love was being forged in the fire of suffering. Yet despite everything, there were small victories. There were times when I felt like life was still worth living, even in the midst of pain. And it was those moments that kept me fighting. I needed to believe there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And although the tunnel was long, I knew I wasn't walking alone. As the months passed, the weight of the treatment felt more familiar, but never less exhausting. I already knew what to expect from each chemotherapy session, the days of extreme weakness, the moments when it felt like my body had given up fighting. But at the same time, something inside me refused to surrender completely. Maybe it was the fact that, despite everything, I still had moments of peace with my family, moments when I forgot about the illness for a second, allowing myself to believe that life could go on. Still, each day was an emotional battle. There were nights when I would lie in bed, with Mark by my side, and stare at the ceiling, wondering if it was all worth it. My body was being destroyed from the inside out, and the doctors still weren't talking about a cure. Each scan showed small signs of progress, but the word, remission, still seemed as far away as it had on the first day. Hannah and Ethan also felt the weight of the situation, even though they were too young to fully understand. They continued to be the light of my life, with their jokes and laughter filling the house with a joy I desperately needed. But sometimes I saw the look of worry on Hannah's face, the way she took in everything around her, like she was waiting for something terrible to happen. Ethan, on the other hand, was more innocent in his perception. He believed I would be okay, and this childish belief gave me the strength to carry on. It was during a particularly difficult afternoon, after one of the most debilitating chemotherapy sessions, that a small spark of hope began to ignite within me. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in blankets, while the kids played in the yard. Mark, as always, was next to me, silently reading something. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, and for a moment, I felt a tranquility I hadn't experienced in months. "I'm scared to believe this will work, Mark," I confessed, breaking the silence. My voice sounded fragile, almost like a whisper. It was the first time I had spoken out loud about my fear of hope. "I'm afraid that if I believe, and something goes wrong, the pain will be unbearable." Mark looked at me, his eyes full of understanding. He felt the same way too, I knew. "I know, Em, I'm scared too, but what else can we do?" "What we have now is the moment, and maybe that's what we should seize." His words kept echoing in my mind. The present. For so long, I held on to the fear of the future, the fear of what could happen, that I forgot to experience what was happening now. I was here. Mark was next to me. My children were running and laughing outside. Wasn't that what really mattered? At that moment, I decided that I needed to start living each day as fully as possible, even if my energy was limited. I didn't know how much time I had, but I knew I could no longer spend my days just waiting for a future that might never come. I had to be there for my family. She had to be a mother and a wife, not just a patient. With this new determination in mind, I started making small changes in my daily life. As simple as they were, these changes made a huge difference from my perspective. I started spending more time with the kids, helping Hannah with her drawings and listening to Ethan tell his endless stories about superheroes and imaginary adventures. It didn't matter that I was exhausted, those moments were everything to me. One afternoon we decided to have a small picnic in the backyard. I was too tired to go to the park, but the garden was enough. Mark made sandwiches, and I laid out a blanket on the lawn, watching as the kids ran around, excited at the idea of doing something so simple and yet special. As I looked at them, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. For a few hours, I forgot about the illness. I forgot about doctor appointments, exams, constant fear. I was just present, living in that moment. It was that same afternoon that Mark, looking lighter than I'd seen him in months, suggested we make plans for the future. Not big plans, like trips or distant projects, but little things, like a special dinner next weekend or a walk to the park. He knew I couldn't do much, physically, but the idea of planning something, anything, made me feel like I still had control over my life, that there was still a life to be lived, despite everything. And that's how we began to rediscover small joys, things that previously seemed insignificant, but now meant the world. I came to cherish every meal shared as a family, every laugh from the children, every hug from Mark before bed. It wasn't a matter of ignoring the cancer or pretending it wasn't there. It was simply a way of not letting the disease consume everything we were. Despite these small emotional victories, the physical challenges continued. My body was still fragile, and there were days when I couldn't get out of bed. The chemotherapy continued relentlessly, and even with small improvements in test results, the internal struggle to maintain hope was exhausting. There were days when I wondered if I was actually moving forward or just prolonging the inevitable. Dr. Wilson, ever cautious, continued to monitor my progress closely. At each appointment, he explained the test results to me clearly, but never offered me guarantees. "We're doing our best, Emily," he said at one of the most recent appointments, his gaze direct but full of empathy. "We are still on the right path, but the process is long. We will continue fighting." I knew he was right. The journey was long and uncertain, but somehow, at that stage, I had come to terms with it. There was an unexpected peace in accepting that the future was uncertain, that I had no control over everything. I could only control how I faced each day, and at that moment, that was enough. With this acceptance came a new way of looking at life. Instead of focusing on what could happen, I decided to focus on what was happening. And what was happening was simple: I was alive. I still had my family by my side, and there was still love, hope, and joy, even in the midst of the darkness. As the weeks passed, something surprising began to happen. My test results began to show more than just stagnation. The tumor, which had once seemed relentless, was shrinking. Doctors were still cautious, but there were smiles at appointments, something I hadn't seen in a long time. It was as if hope was slowly seeping into those sterile white hospital walls. "Emily," said Dr. Wilson at a consultation, "we're seeing a response to treatment that is better than we expected. I don't want to give you false hope, but things are moving in the right direction." I didn't know how to respond. For months, I prepared for the worst. Now, there was a new possibility on the horizon. It still wasn't a cure, but it was the closest I had come to believing it could be possible. The news that my body was finally responding to the treatment with more vigor brought a whirlwind of emotions. On the one hand, I felt relieved and almost excited. It was the first time in months that the word hope seemed to have any real, palpable weight. But on the other hand, I couldn't allow myself to believe it completely. What if something went wrong again? The shadow of relapse still hung over me, like a cloud that could break or become a storm at any moment. Mark, however, seemed to breathe differently. The tension in his shoulders, something I'd barely noticed before because it had become part of who he was now beginning to dissipate. He was visibly lighter. Not that he was free from worry. I knew he still kept his fears quiet, but something in him had changed. He seemed to believe again. And that affected me deeply. I also saw the change in the children. They knew something was different, even if we hadn't told them everything in detail. Children are sensitive to what's going on around them, and Hannah, in particular, seemed more relieved. She continued to draw her flowers and landscapes, but now, there were more frequent smiles and a lightness in her eyes that wasn't there before. Ethan was still the little whirlwind of energy he always was, but even he somehow seemed less concerned, even though he didn't fully understand what was going on. Despite the hope that was beginning to be reborn, the days were not easy. Each medical appointment brought a mix of fear and expectation. Each new scan was a reminder of the fragility of my situation, and I constantly struggled to balance between the desire to believe and the fear of disappointment. On one of the nights when I was particularly exhausted, after a long conversation with Dr. Wilson about the next steps in my treatment, Mark found me sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by the letters I had written to Hannah and Ethan. The letters were a refuge, something that kept me connected to their future if I were no longer around. Mark sat next to me in silence, watching as I patted the slightly crumpled papers. "Do you think you'll need them?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I looked at him, unable to hold back the tears that started to fall. "I don't know, Mark. I really don't know." He took my hand and squeezed it lightly, an attempt to comfort me. "I think maybe these letters aren't so necessary anymore." His words hung in the air, and although I knew he was trying to give me hope, part of me still wasn't ready to fully believe it. What if the cancer came back? What if I was one of the people who got worse when they seemed to be getting better? But that night, I decided I needed to live differently. Even if it was for a limited time, I didn't want to spend every second in fear of the future. I wanted to truly live, embrace life and be there for my family. That would be my new goal, living in the now. From that moment on, I began to see each day as an opportunity. It wasn't that it was easy, the treatments still weakened me, and moments of physical weakness still existed, but there was something different in the way I saw things. I was learning to free myself from constant fear. I still felt that tightness in my chest before every appointment, but now I was more focused on making the most of the time I had, rather than just surviving. Mark, seeing this change in me, became my accomplice in this new approach. Together, we started planning little moments of happiness. We went to a local coffee shop, something we hadn't done in months. We sat at an outdoor table and drank coffee, watching the people on the street, like we used to do before this whole storm. It was a small act, but to us, at that moment, it seemed monumental. Over the weekend we decided to take a short trip to a park outside of town. I was aware of my limitations and knew it wouldn't be easy, but I felt like I needed to get out of that bubble of consultations and treatments. Hannah and Ethan were thrilled with the idea, and Mark organized everything carefully, ensuring I was comfortable. At the park, we watched children run through the trees, their laughter echoing in the fresh air. It was one of the first times I felt like I was somehow coming back to life. During this little escape from reality, Mark approached me as we watched the children play in the distance. He leaned in and said softly, "I knew you were strong, but I didn't know how strong." I smiled, excited. "I'm not that strong, Mark. I'm just trying to do the best I can. We both are, Em." And sometimes, that's more than enough. That afternoon, as the sun set over the horizon, I set aside worries about the upcoming exams and allowed myself to be completely present in that moment. Mark was right. We were doing the best we could, and that was all we could control. The following days brought more consultations and exams, but I no longer faced them with the same despair. Instead, I saw each of them as a step that brought me closer to the future, no longer as something that threatened to end it. Dr. Wilson remained optimistic, although always careful with his words. He knew there were still uncertainties, but each new exam showed a small progress, a breakthrough. The tumor was shrinking faster than anyone expected, and now the word, remission, was starting to be mentioned more frequently. Even with this good news, the fear of relapse still hung over me. Sometimes I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing, worried about what the next few months would bring. But instead of sinking into this fear, I sought strength in the moments I lived, in the children's laughter, in Mark's hugs. It was on one of those nights, as I reflected on everything I had been through, that I realized how much the illness had changed me. I wasn't the same person I was before, and maybe that was one of the few good things cancer had taught me. I had learned to value the present, to recognize the strength in small acts of love and to allow myself to feel vulnerable, without being ashamed of it. I also started thinking about other people who, like me, were facing their own silent battles. I started writing not just to my children, but to other women who might be going through the same thing. My writing, which had once been a personal refuge, began to transform into something I wanted to share. I wanted to tell my story so that other people would know that even in the midst of chaos and pain, there was still beauty and strength. And most of all, there was still hope. As time went on, the word, remission, began to gain more traction. Dr. Wilson, always cautious, now spoke with a little more conviction, although he never promised a complete cure. But for me, just hearing that word over and over was a balm. I was slowly starting to believe that there could be a future for me beyond fighting cancer. What once seemed impossible, dreaming about tomorrow, now became a real possibility. There was still fear, of course. There was always that little voice in the back of my mind that reminded me that things could change suddenly. But that voice, which once paralyzed me, now seemed like a distant whisper, suffocated by the hope that was growing inside me. Mark also looked refreshed. He, who had carried the weight of uncertainty for so long, now began to plan the future with more clarity. We talked again about the trip to Italy, a dream that had been postponed for so long. No longer as a distant promise, but as something we could actually achieve. We talked about places to visit, the foods we would try, and most importantly, what the trip would mean to us. Not just as a couple, but as a family who had been through so much. But besides the plans, there was also everyday life, which was slowly returning to normal. I started doing things that previously seemed impossible. Taking the kids to school, helping Hannah with her homework, watching movies with Ethan without feeling exhausted after a few minutes. Little moments that, before the illness, I had taken for granted, were now treasures that I held in my heart. One autumn afternoon, I sat down with Dr. Wilson for another consultation. He explained to me, with his usual frankness, that the tests showed a significant reduction in the tumor. "Emily," he said, "we are getting to the point where we can consider the cancer in complete remission." These words, which I so longed to hear, hit me with unexpected force. I should be happy, and I was. But at the same time, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. And now? How would I move forward after having lived under the weight of illness for so long? What would life be like without cancer? Dr. Wilson, noticing my hesitation, smiled gently. "I know this is a lot to process, and I'm not saying the road ahead will be easy. Remission is not a guaranteed cure, but it is a giant step. The important thing right now is to live in the present and not let fear hold you back. Prevent you from enjoying what you have achieved." Those words were engraved in my mind. Live the present. That's what I had tried to do for the last few months, but now, with the news of remission, it took on a new meaning. I had a chance to live. In truth, without the constant shadow of illness, I could allow myself to dream again. I could allow myself to believe that the future existed. When I told Mark the news that night, he was silent for a few seconds, absorbing what I had said. I saw the relief and happiness fighting to dominate his face. His eyes filled with tears, and he simply hugged me, tightly, as if he never wanted to let me go again. "We did it," he whispered, voice cracking with emotion. "You did it, Emily." I cried with him. They were tears of relief, of joy, but also of sadness for the months of suffering and uncertainty we had faced. We knew the road was still long, that the cancer could return one day, but at that moment, all that mattered was that we were together and that I was alive. The news of remission also brought new life to our family. The children, who had already noticed the changes in me, now understood that Mommy was really getting better. Hannah, always the most sensitive, stood closer to me, as if she wanted to make the most of every moment. "You said," as the months passed, life began to take on a new rhythm. I still made frequent visits to the hospital for exams and follow-ups, but now something was different. It was no longer absolute fear that dominated me at each appointment. I knew the fight was continuing, but I also knew that somehow I was winning. Remission was a real possibility. Dr. Wilson, always so cautious, now mentioned the word with more confidence. Test results showed that the tumor continued to shrink, and each treatment session seemed to bring more hope that the cancer was, in fact, receding. Still, I clung to the idea that living fully meant being present, regardless of what the future held. There were times when the fear still crept in, like a silent shadow that appeared in the night. I knew the cancer could return at any time, that there were no guarantees, but I decided I wouldn't let this uncertainty steal the joy I had rediscovered. Mark was my anchor on this new path. Throughout this journey, he had been a pillar of silent strength, always by my side, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. We had been through the worst times together, and now, with the future opening up before us more clearly, I felt like our bond was even deeper. The disease had tested us in ways we never imagined, but it had also taught us the true value of partnership, love, and mutual support. The children, in turn, continued to remind me of the importance of living in the present. Hannah and Ethan didn't know all the details, but in a way, they knew I was better. They noticed the difference in my behavior. I was more active, more involved. I went back to helping them with their schoolwork and participating in the activities they loved, even if it was just watching them run around the yard. Life had returned to some of the normality we so longed for. Despite the good news, the truth was that I was still in the recovery phase, both physically and emotionally. I knew the path to complete healing was not simple, but every small step forward was cause for celebration. My relationship with Mark also deepened. During the darkest months, we had both carried the weight of uncertainty and pain, and now, as the clouds began to lift, there was a sense of renewal. "I've been thinking," Mark said one quiet night as we sat on the couch, the kids already asleep. "We talked a lot about the Italy trip before all this started. Do you think we should get back to planning?" I looked at him, surprised. It had been so long since we thought about something as distant as an international trip. "Do you think it's safe to make plans for the future now?" My voice had a cautious tone, but inside, I wanted to say yes. I really wanted to believe that we were ready to start over. Mark smiled, but his eyes still carried that wariness that all survivors of great battles know. "I think if we don't start dreaming again, we risk letting the disease define the rest of our lives. Maybe it's time to look to the future, even if we don't have all the answers." His words touched me deeply. He was right. For a long time, our lives had been guided by illness, exams, and treatments. Now, we needed something more. We needed a dream, something to remind us that life wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning again. And that's how we started planning our trip. Not to next month, not to next semester, but to the future, to a time when I was completely recovered and ready to embrace all that life still had to offer. It was an important step, not only in terms of planning, but also emotionally. We were finally allowing the future to once again be something we could contemplate with joy, not fear. As I continued to recover, I started writing more frequently. My letters to Hannah and Ethan, once full of goodbyes and advice about how to live without me, now turned into something different. They still contained advice, they were still a way to make sure my children knew how much I loved them, but now they also had a new message. That life goes on, even after the toughest battles. In addition to letters to my children, I began writing about my experience more broadly. I wanted to share my story with other women who might be facing the same challenge. I started to consider the possibility of turning my writings into a book, something that could inspire other people not to give up, to believe that healing, or at least a new way of living, was possible. Writing helped me process everything I had been through. It was a way to organize my thoughts, to make sense of the chaos that the illness had brought into my life. And, more than that, it was a way of reconnecting with the world, of not isolating myself in the role of patient, but of seeing myself again as someone capable of contributing, helping, inspiring. "I think you should do this," Mark said one day, as I showed him a draft of one of my letters that I intended to turn into a chapter. "People need to hear your story, Emily. They need to know they are not alone in this fight." He was right. I knew that, like me, many other women were going through the same uncertainties, fears and challenges. If my story could help even one person find the strength to carry on, then all my suffering would have some purpose. Over time, appointments with Dr. Wilson became less frequent. With each exam, the results showed that the cancer was, in fact, in remission. The word that once seemed so distant was now a reality. But even so, the idea of a total cure was still discussed with caution. Dr. Wilson always made a point of reminding me that although remission was an extremely positive sign, follow-up would be ongoing for years to come. I knew that battle would never be completely forgotten, but at that moment, I was willing to accept the future with all its uncertainties. There was one last appointment coming up, the one where Dr. Wilson would finally tell me if I was officially in remission. I prepared for that moment with a mix of anxiety and hope, knowing that regardless of the answer, I had done my best. My family was by my side, and I was ready for whatever came. Mark held my hand as we walked into Dr. Wilson's office. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, but something inside me, something new and strong, told me I was ready to face anything. When Dr. Wilson entered, he smiled in a way he rarely did. "Emily, your scans are clear. There are no signs of cancer." "You are officially in complete remission." Those words echoed in the room like thunder. Mark squeezed my hand tightly, and I felt tears run down my face, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief, of joy, of gratitude. I had survived. I was alive. Dr. Wilson's words echoed in my mind for days after that last appointment. Complete remission. There was no way to describe them other than as a miracle. A miracle built by months of suffering, hope, fear and faith. I was officially cancer-free, but I knew that, in some ways, the journey didn't end there. There were scars, physical and emotional, that still needed healing, and a new life to be rediscovered. I left the office with Mark by my side, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the invisible weight I had been carrying was gone. The air felt lighter, the world seemed brighter, as if everything around me was waiting for me to truly live again. I wanted to take a deep breath, run to my children, hug them and tell them everything was going to be okay. Because finally, I believed it. When we got home, Hannah and Ethan ran to me like they did every day, but there was something different that afternoon. They didn't know the news yet, but something in their behavior reflected the lightness I felt. Hannah, always attentive, noticed that something had changed. She looked at me with those big brown eyes, full of curiosity, and said, "Mommy, you're happy, aren't you?" I smiled, hugging her tightly, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. "Yes, I am, darling. I'm very happy." Ethan, with his childish energy, didn't mind the words. He just jumped with joy, as if he knew that Mom was somehow more present than ever. I hugged them, feeling my heart fill with gratitude. I had promised them that I would do everything I could to improve, and now, I could fulfill that promise. Mark stood next to me, watching the scene with teary eyes. He was always the rock I leaned on, but I knew how difficult this journey had been for him too. That afternoon, as the kids ran around the yard and the sun began to set over the horizon, he hugged me from behind, whispering in my ear, "We did it, Emily. We did it." The days following the news of his remission brought a different kind of challenge, rebuilding his life. I knew that even though the cancer was gone, my life would never go back to the way it had been before, and in some ways, I didn't want it to. The disease changed me, it changed us. There was a depth to our family that I hadn't been able to see before. There was a new appreciation for the small moments, the conversations around the table, the silent hugs before bed. The first thing we did was revisit the idea of the trip to Italy. What once seemed like a distant dream was now something tangible, something we could finally plan with enthusiasm. Mark and I spent whole nights researching places to visit, imagining what it would be like to see the blue sea of the Amalfi Coast, walk the streets of Rome and show the children the beauty of places we had only seen in photos. But, more than that, the trip became a symbol for us. It was not just a reward for what we had been through, but a celebration of the life that had been given back to us. I knew that it didn't matter where we went, the most important thing was to be together. Illness had painfully shown me that time is the most precious thing we have, and now I was determined not to waste another second. Over time, I realized that my story needed to be shared. I had learned so many lessons along the way, and I knew that other people, other women like me, could find strength in the words I had to say. I started turning the letters I wrote to Hannah and Ethan into chapters of a book, a kind of memorial of what I experienced, but also a celebration of how I overcame it. The writing process was, in itself, healing. Remembering the darkest moments, the moments of despair, and seeing how I had come out on the other side brought me a sense of accomplishment. I realized that the pain I experienced had not been in vain. There was something bigger than this, a message I needed to share with the world. One day, at the end of a long writing session, I showed Mark what I had written. He read it silently, and when he finished, his eyes were full of tears. "This will help a lot of people, Em," he said hoarsely. "You're giving hope to people who maybe are in the same place you were." That's powerful. I knew he was right. Hope was the greatest gift I could offer. More than practical advice on how to cope with chemotherapy or deal with fatigue, I wanted people to know that, even in the darkest moments, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And that light didn't come from outside, it came from within. If you are listening to this story, you're probably going through something I know all too well. A silent fight, where fear seems to be your only companion and the future seems uncertain. I understand what you are feeling. I've been there, and for a while, I also thought my path would end there. But I'm here to tell you that there is hope. I know that sometimes everything seems impossible. That the tiredness is too much, that the bad news never seems to stop. But I also know that even in the darkest moments, there is light. Maybe it's small, almost invisible, but it's there, and you can find it. It is in the love of those who are by your side, in the strength you didn't even know you had, in the ability to resist even when everything seems lost. Life is a fragile gift, and that's exactly what makes it so precious. And I want you to know that as long as there is life, there is hope. No matter how difficult the journey is, you can find the strength to continue. And when you look back, you'll see how far you've come. Keep fighting, keep believing. The path may be difficult, but there is light at the end. And you deserve to see that light. With all my love and hope, Emily.
If this story captured and moved you, don't forget to like the video, share with those who love intense stories like this, and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing more narratives that will surprise you and stir your emotions. Don't miss the next chapter of this incredible journey.